Hello, this is Coding Gicha for full-stack developers. I'll cover how to install MariaDB on Ubuntu and query SQL statements. MySQL and MariaDB are the world's most widely used open-source relational DBMSs. With the acquisition of Sun Microsystems by Oracle, MySQL is now under an uncertain license owned by Oracle. Therefore, MariaDB was created in the open-source community based on MySQL. Windows doesn't support installation via repositories, so you'll need to download and install the installation file on Windows. However, installing via a repository allows you to install it with your System Package Manager and automatically receive updates. Let's select the Ubuntu distribution you're using. Ubuntu 24.04 is codenamed Noble. Starting in third quarter 2025, MariaDB will use a regular pattern of 3 rolling releases and 1 LTS release per quarter. The LTS release will be released in the second quarter of the year following the first rolling release. The first rolling release of the regular release will be 12.0, and after 2 more rolling releases, MariaDB 12.3 will become the LTS release. The official release of MariaDB 12.3 is scheduled for second quarter 2026. Therefore, the current LTS release is MariaDB 11.8, which is before the regular releases. Currently, MariaDB 12.3 is a pre-release RC version, but there's no indication of this, and the version is only displayed as a major version. This is because installing from a repository will automatically update to the official LTS version by the System Package Manager even if you install the RC version. I will accept the default repository mirror address. Scrolling down the screen will show installation instructions for the repository based on your selected configuration. You can install by copying and pasting the command into the terminal. Let's launch the terminal. Let's import the MariaDB repository key. There are 2 ways to register MariaDB's apt repository: multi-line style and one-line style. Multi-line style is the newer, stanza-based format. Create a file with an intuitive name, such as MariaDB.sources. Paste the copied configuration. I'll remove any comments to focus on the configuration. I recommend setting the architecture to AMD 64. The 32-bit OS architecture is no longer used. If you don't set the OS architecture, you'll see a warning that the repository for the 32-bit OS architecture will also be updated every time apt is updated, indicating a failure. Let's update the file to reflect the added repository. I'll install the MariaDB server using apt. Once the installation is complete, you need to run the MariaDB secure installation command. Since there's no root password yet, press Enter. You'll be asked whether to authenticate using Unix socket authentication. Set it to N. If you configure authentication using Unix socket authentication, authentication will be performed using your operating system account. Note that starting with MariaDB 10.4, if the operating system account and the MariaDB account registered are the same, authentication will be performed using Unix socket authentication regardless of the settings. This means that if the operating system's root user is running, you can connect to MariaDB's root account without a password. Since the MariaDB root account password is not set, press Enter. Enter a new password. Enter the same password again. Configure the remaining settings to suit your environment. In a development environment, you'll likely want to use SQL queries through a GUI tool. I'll cover the GUI SQL query client in a separate video, but in this video I'll use MariaDB Monitor for CLI, which is supported by default. Linux servers are accessed via SSH, and command line commands are just available, so basic tasks must be performed in the terminal. I'll create a schema to manage the tables. The basic architecture of an RDBMS is that an RDBMS instance consists of databases, and each database consists of schemas. For reference, in the case of Oracle, an instance consists of only one database. MariaDB uses both database and schema interchangeably, but for compatibility with general-purpose RDBMS architectures, it may be better to use a schema rather than a database. Up to MariaDB 11.4 LTS, the default character set is not UTF-8 but is aligned with the operating system encoding. Therefore, for compatibility with Windows environments, it's recommended to specify UTF-8 as the default character set for the schema you create. For MariaDB on Linux, UTF-8 is an alias of UTF-8 MB4, which supports emojis. However, for MariaDB on Windows, UTF-8 is an alias of UTF-8 MB3, so you must specify MB4 as well. Of course, starting with MariaDB 11.8 LTS, when the default character set changed to UTF-8, UTF-8 also became an alias of UTF-8 MB4 regardless of the operating system. Therefore, if you're not considering Windows or only need support for MariaDB 11.8 LTS or later, you can remove the default character set option. Let's move on to the desired schema. I need to create tables and insert data, but MariaDB Monitor writes queries line by line, which is not convenient. It provides the ability to write and execute queries in a buffer that can accommodate multiple lines. The CL as default text editor will launch. Personally, I prefer writing and executing SQL files rather than buffer files. Here I haven't written the SQL statement in the buffer, but to execute the SQL statement, simply enter a semicolon. To cancel a SQL statement without executing it, type \C. To exit, type exit. Let's move to the directory where I'll write and execute the SQL statement. I'll create an SQL file that creates a BOM table. I'll create a BOM table that manages materials in a hierarchical structure. Tables and fields will be covered in detail in a separate section explaining how to implement the BOM using tree view and block diagram methods. MariaDB supports various storage engines. The default storage engine is InnoDB. You can override the schema's default character set to set a default character set for each table. If you're not considering Windows or only support MariaDB 11.8 LTS or later, you can skip setting the default character set. Since InnoDB is the default storage engine, you can also omit this step. I'll split the SQL file into a terminal window at the bottom to view the contents of the SQL file you're working on. To work on the terminal while viewing the contents of the SQL file being written, I will split the terminal window to the bottom of the SQL file. When running MariaDB Monitor, you can specify a schema and directly execute the SQL file created using the input redirection operator. Since the BOM table has already been created, re-executing the SQL file will result in a duplicate table error. Let's add a statement to create the BOM table only if it doesn't exist. I'll insert data into the BOM table. The issuedif field should be a date type, but I'll use an ISO date format string to avoid cross-platform conversion. If you execute the SQL file using the input redirection operator, you'll need to re-enter your password each time. I'll run MariaDB Monitor while specifying the schema. You can execute the SQL file directly using the source command. To retain the previous query and add to it, comment out the previous query. I'll insert data into the BOM table again. You can re-execute the SQL file using the source command from unconnected MariaDB Monitor without entering a password each time. Linux has excellent CLI support, so you can work with it without major inconvenience. However, most people are more comfortable working with the GUI than the CLI. If you want to work with the GUI SQL query client in a development environment, I personally recommend Beekeeper Studio. If you use Visual Studio Code as your IDE tool, I also recommend the Database Client extension. If you find installing and running a separate application cumbersome, this is a good alternative. Personally, I'm sensitive to capitalization and whitespace, and since Beekeeper Studio isn't an IDE tool, the lack of support for these issues makes the Database Client extension a good option. Thank you for watching.